This session is going to be about the potential for greenhouse gas removals in agriculture. In this case, we're talking one about carbon dioxide removals and storage out of the atmosphere, but also mitigation of and avoidance of emissions. So we're going to have a bit of a well-rounded panel here from the agricultural sector in general. I'm Allegra Mayer. I'm one of the lead authors of the cropland soils chapter in the roadster removal. So if you have any questions about that chapter, I'm happy to answer your questions. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel here, and then I'll frame our panel, and then we'll get into some questions. So on the end, we have Mary Yap from Lithos, Dipti Pita from the University of Pennsylvania Veterinary School. In the middle, we have Jane Zelikova from Colorado State University. And then finally, we have Alyssa Charney from the USDA. So a really nice, well-rounded panel. So I want to start off by framing the idea of natural solutions, not just natural solutions, but agricultural management, which can come in a number of forms. First of all, in the report, we talked about three main strategies: cover cropping and perennial cropping, which can be harvested for biomass with carbon removal and sequestration, or you act as field borders. Some of the benefits of these are that they can reduce erosion, they can increase water infiltration down deep into the soil, which can help adapt to future climate change. So we think of the carbon dioxide removal piece of actually being a side benefit. It's a bonus that we can get out of this. There's not only one reason to apply these management techniques. In fact, there's like many, many reasons. So it's a holistic benefit. The second thing I want to point out here, and we're going to talk about this a lot, I think, on this panel and also in future panels, is the durability in agricultural solutions. So Dipti is going to talk about avoiding emissions altogether. That's our first priority. And that's been said throughout the day today, and we're going to continue to talk about it. We want to avoid emissions first and foremost. But secondly, when we are thinking about storing carbon in ecological solutions, and especially in agricultural soils, there's not really a guarantee that that carbon is going to stay there forever. And in fact, one of the main levers for maintaining carbon is incentivizing that management to continue over and over. So we think about this as a short-term solution that we can implement immediately. It's rather cheap. It's one of the low-hanging fruit that we can get to when it comes to carbon removal and mitigation, but also it's not necessarily a permanent solution. So it's something we have to think about investing in long-term and as a bridge towards more permanent solutions in the future. Of course, we remember that it has holistic benefits, so it's not something to ignore, but maybe on our path for CDR, we want to think of it as a bridge. And then finally, I want to point out that those three management techniques that I talked about earlier, that is not comprehensive of the potential management that we can use in agriculture. And that some of the things that we didn't include just because of accounting issues and because of we didn't have enough data to comprehensively measure county by county are practices like amending compost to rangelands to croplands, biochar, as JP mentioned earlier, and applying enhanced rock weathering, which leads us perfectly into our next panelist, which is going to be Mary Yap from Lithos. I'd like her to introduce herself, but also, can you tell us about Lithos's approach to carbon dioxide removal, how enhanced rock weathering is distinct from other CDR practices, especially in agriculture?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Mary. I'm co-founder and CEO of Lithos Carbon. A little bit about me. I studied plant biology at the University of Chicago and geology and earth and planetary sciences at Yale University. And fun fact, my family are crop farmers in the highlands of Taiwan. So this work is very near and dear to me and my family. More about Lithos and how we're differentiated from different pathways in agricultural removals or in agricultural mitigation. So Lithos Carbon, as mentioned, is an enhanced rock weathering company, and I'll give like a 30-second explainer about what that means. We're basically inspired by nature, and we're able to do permanent carbon removal that captures carbon from the atmosphere and stores it for 10,000 to 100,000 years. How that works in the natural world is when carbon dioxide is circulating above the globe, combines with rainwater and clouds to create acid rain or carbonic acid, but we call it acid rain. We've all heard of that. When that hits volcanic silicate rocks, leads to a special chemical reaction that transforms that CO2 and that rain into something called bicarbonate, it's chalky white stuff that limestone is made out of, that can flow off in the rivers, go into the ocean, become the shells of phytoplankton, and eventually can be deposited in the bottom of the ocean for 100,000 years. It's a really powerful process, removes about 1.1 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year naturally. And by accelerating that process through human techniques, we can actually get that to happen 100 to 1,000 times faster. So a few details about how we're a little bit differentiated from different agricultural techniques and why we're excited about this as a scalable pathway. One, it's permanent, which we talked about very briefly. Number two, it can be very cost effective. At our team, we use waste byproducts that come from the aggregate mining industry. About 20% of their products are superfine dust that has a really high surface area, and that can actually capture carbon in a matter of human seasons and years rather than thousands and thousands of years. Three, it actually can really help crop farmers, and that's a massive thing for adoption. In some of our studies, we've done trials for about 10 years now. We've seen crop yield increases of up to 30%, not on every farm, and in published results, 12 to 14% in major row crops. So it actually helps enrich the soils, rebuild soils, prevent topsoil erosion. That's really critical. As coming from a farming family myself, it's really important to think about what we're doing to land not just right now, but for future generations. And fourth, it builds on existing practices. Farmers are very familiar with spreading rock dust. We're actually able to replace expensive products the farmers use today, like limestone, that can sometimes emit CO2. It is spread with existing technology, tractors and spreaders, which farmers use today. So it doesn't look completely novel to them. It doesn't require them to spend upfront costs, and there can be the really big crop benefits. So we're trying to figure out how do we scale this thing from academic research into highly rigorous, scientifically high quality carbon removals. So at the moment, Lithos is deployed in 10 different states. We're working on tens of thousands of acres, and we've deployed 250,000 tons of rock. And we're just getting data on every single one of our farms to understand how we can better measure this, learn about it out in the wild, and optimize it further to scale to megatons. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mary. Next, I'd like Dipti to introduce herself and also answer a little bit about what are some of the gaps in our understanding about emissions from the livestock sector, and what are you doing in your work to mitigate those emissions?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Veterinary Medicine. I'm not here on campus. I'm actually off campus, and we are 35 miles away at New Bolton Center. We have a dairy farm, a swine farm, and we work with animals, and we see animals more often than people, actually. So being a veterinarian myself and having a background in animal nutrition, my first question is, what can we do to improve animal productivity? That's kind of one of our first missions, like health and production, right? But then when we talk about health and production and how livestock are so important in converting the energy that's harnessed in plants to useful products such as milk and meat, and which is feeding the world, obviously, there are some side effects to that, which is methane, obviously one of the greenhouse gas that's naturally being released into the environment. So there we talk about the first challenge is we can't just simply eliminate or apply any mitigation strategies to livestock systems to remove methane, but it comes with a trade-off, like you can't really have a decrease in production or performance of animals. So enteric methane mitigation is an ancient problem to all animal nutritionists and animal scientists, and it's been there for past 6 to 7 decades now. And efforts have been in place trying to see how we could reduce methane formation without compromising animal health and production. That's one of our priorities. And so what have we achieved thus far? Probably a handful of strategies that we could apply to animal systems to reduce methane, maybe marginally. And then the big bottleneck is methane comes out as a exclusively formed by microbial populations known as methanogenic archaea. It seemed to be there's only a single group of microbes, but it happens to be that there's tons of different methanogenic archaea that contribute to this problem. Now, this is where it becomes complex, is the type of different methanogens present in the cow's gut is going to vary from place to place and based on different animal breeds and so on. So it's not really that one magic solution is going to reduce amount of methane being formed. And third, most important, is there's no single technology out there, not anything that's practically feasible to measure and track these methane emissions from cows. Now we have approximately 3 billion cows globally and about 100 million cows, cattle in the United States, and we can't really measure methane from every single cow. That's going to vary from place to place. So I'm talking about all the challenges out there, but what am I, or what's my program about in trying to deal with indirect methane mitigation? So we are trying to address all these problems at the root level. The first thing is we are trying to come up with strategies where we could use some sort of non-invasive methods to measure methane emissions from individual cows and also from herds. So we have some sort of robust, sophisticated equipment to measure methane from individual animals that are kind of limited to a research setting, but we are trying to work with technologies that could allow us to track methane emissions on commercial herds. This is really essential because if we were to come up with some sort of innovative technologies or innovative mitigation strategies to reduce methane, there we have a standard to measure and track, and also say like effectively we could reduce so much % of methane reduction from livestock. So that's kind of the first thing. Second thing is, since the past 1 decade, we had been working on strategies, so trying to identify cows with low methane emitting potential, because genetics, obviously methane is moderately heritable, and so we want to identify cows that can naturally emit less methane, which we want to select for and use this in future herds. Then we want to bring a complex group of different mitigation strategies, but my program is mostly centered on trying to understand the mechanistic basis of methane formation, so that once we know what sort of microbes are present, we could bring in a different group of strategies that could effectively reduce methane. So applying molecular techniques, applying AI to our data sets, we are able to identify strategies that could effectively reduce methane. And I think the most emerging technologies that we have is trying to come up with a probiotic-prebiotic combination that could be applied to calves that are born at birth, so that we could track methane emissions later on, could reduce methane that could be carried on later in life. So those are some of the technologies that we are trying to address to reduce methane, because methane itself incurs energy losses to the cow, and we wanted to save as much energy for the cow and also help the environment.
Thank you, Dipti. Next, we have Jane Zelikova from Colorado State. I'd love for you to introduce yourself, but then also, we know from the roads to removal report that carbon dioxide removal solutions are not one size fits all, and certainly not when it comes to agricultural and soil carbon. So what are some of the characteristics that you think of as understanding how a particular project is the right or the wrong fit for a particular place?
Hi, everybody. Thanks. That's a great question. My name is Jane. I direct a relatively new interdisciplinary center at Colorado State University called the Soil Carbon Solutions Center. Our mission is to focus on climate mitigation and addressing potentially building and scaling climate solutions that are based in soil in some way. And we definitely work beyond just carbon, but carbon is in the name. And once it's in the name, you can't get it out. And the main thing about being an interdisciplinary center, for those of you who do interdisciplinary work or try to at a university, is that there are some inherent challenges in pulling lots of disciplines together, but that's what's necessary to address climate change. So we have to work with lots of engineers, computer scientists, social scientists, geographers, people in the humanities, as well as like sort of basic soil and soil ecology and biogeochemistry folks. So it's a really exciting area to do work because we get to think about things from lots of different perspectives. To address your question, I think one thing that I liked about the Roads to Removal report is that there's this map in the report that kind of shows the suite of solutions that are kind of recommended. And we know that the Roads to Removal report is not comprehensive. And then for the cropland and ag chapter, certainly not every solution was addressed. And one of the things that I was thinking about if I were to be a lead author on that, and I think it was a challenge, is that there are some really major data gaps that make it really hard to figure out what solution needs to be applied where. And that probably would be one of the biggest challenges, is sort of having the data that you need to be able to optimize for all the different factors that have to be optimized, including applying the right sort of cropland or grazing land solution to the right location. Do you want to add biochar to that location, or should it be should you be considering enhanced rock weathering as a potential solution? So when I think about, and the work that we do at the Soil Carbon Solutions Center is to think about this at a bigger scale, what combination of sort of practices or solutions to apply where. One of the first kind of things is, where do we have data? And what sorts of data do we need, and how do we fill the data gaps when we have them? And if we don't have data, do we have models, and do we think the models we're applying are representative, comprehensive? Are there gaps in how the models describe the world? Can we build better models that describe what's actually happening in the soil? Soils for a really long time were considered a black box. We couldn't really see what's going on in there. And the more that we learned about soils, the more we learned that microbes, like in the guts of livestock, are really driving all of the transformation of carbon in the soil. And how much do we understand how microbial communities work? What are the microbial consortia? Which kind of species, or even like suites of species, are driving carbon transformation under what types of conditions? And that's what makes it really hard to sort of tailor a suite of solutions to a particular geography or particular agricultural context. Is like, we don't really know what the microbes are doing. And then what we do at the Soil Carbon Solutions Center is layer on top of that human behavior. So we're trying to predict what microbes are going to do, try to predict what humans are going to do. So a lot of agricultural solutions rely on the willingness of a farmer or a rancher to do a particular thing with a parcel of land. And they're considering a lot of different factors when they're making decisions about management. And those decisions are made on a week, month, and maybe even annual basis. And they're certainly trying to balance the financial realities of their particular production system with the cultural context in which they're managing their agricultural system, with the global commodity market and the commodities that they're growing and the price of that, with the existing policy, which includes some policies that are incentivizing them to do certain things, and some policies that stand in the way of switching practices to something different. And that makes it really, really challenging to figure out what suite of solutions needs to be applied where. So I think I kind of punted the question by saying it's really hard. But at least maybe I listed the factors that we would need to consider. And that includes the tiny, tiny microbes and what they do in the world, and also complex human beings whose decision-making is really difficult to predict.
Jane, that's actually a perfect segue for our next speaker, Alyssa Charney from the USDA. I'd love for you to introduce yourself as well. And then to kind of get into what Jane is talking about is, how do we get farmers to implement these solutions, and how do you already do that right now at the USDA?
Great. Thank you so much. Really great to be here and join for this discussion. My name's Alyssa Charney. I'm within the Farm Production and Conservation Mission Area of USDA. And that includes exactly what it says. We support farmers in kind of a number of different areas of their work, whether that be production related to assistance when they've got disaster, or voluntary conservation strategies and solutions. I've been at USDA for going on 4 years, initially in the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that's the agency that's got 10,000 staff across the country working directly with farmers on the ground, trying to kind of figure out that question of what do they want, what makes sense. And then I took a brief break over to the White House Climate Policy Office, so kind of centering this conversation around agriculture and natural solutions within a broader conversation about the work that we're doing in the administration on climate mitigation. And so now back at USDA, continuing to answer these same questions and challenges. I think it's a really exciting place to be for this conversation because at USDA, we both kind of are doing the research. We're trying to answer the really hard questions about where's the data, what strategies make most sense. And then we are also trying to serve farmers on a daily basis across the country who are not just wanting to be part of the climate solution, but are also dealing with the forces that are outside of their control. They are dealing with prices that are outside of their control, and so balancing all of those pieces. And I think it's a really important question in terms of how do we make that incentive work? How do we ensure that farmers are continuing to show up to say, I want to be part of the solution? And I think a couple of things on our kind of theory of the case at USDA. I think first it's important to mention that this is a really exciting time to be trying to do this work. We've seen historic investments in climate smart agriculture, first through the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided nearly $20 billion in climate smart agriculture assistance through our existing voluntary conservation programs. Additionally, USDA stood up a new program called Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. So essentially creating new market opportunities for farmers and ranchers to adopt climate strategies and then create those market opportunities. And as we do that, I think about, maybe if I can generalize, two things. One, how do we make sure it works for the farmer? And two, how do we make sure we are also doing this in pace and aligned with the science, the data, where we know there are gaps, there are needs. I think pulling together those two different priorities is really challenging, but also really important. On the kind of how do we make this work for farmers side of things, we are putting solutions out there that are voluntary, that are incentive-based, that are locally led, right? We know that climate smart agriculture in Colorado looks nothing like climate smart agriculture in Iowa. And so we work through a locally led process that still kind of takes here's the overarching list of climate strategies, climate mitigation practices, but then take that down to the local level where you have a state technical committee who is advising you on this is what works here and this is what doesn't. Incentive-based, also hugely important. If it's not going to work for that bottom line for a farmer, you know, they care, but they also have to make a living. They have to make it work at the end of the day. So we are continuing to think through what are the creative ways to do that, whether that is creating new market opportunities for new products, whether it is thinking through how do we kind of pair this with additional financing solutions, and how do we kind of stack different options that are there to make it make sense. And so really leaning into kind of how do we make it market-based? How is it locally led? How are we ensuring that farmers are in the driver's seat? At the same time, I think we are fully kind of aware of the fact that there is a lot of data and a lot of measurement that needs to happen to continue to prove up these strategies. We're doing that in a number of ways. That Inflation Reduction Act funding I mentioned also included $300 million specifically for measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification of those strategies. So we are doing both at the same time, right? We are saying, we've got billions of dollars. We've got farmers who want to sign up for these programs. Let's get that money out the door. But also, let's stand up a really comprehensive network where we can kind of prove up these strategies, figure out what needs to be improved, et cetera. Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities, all of those partner-led projects also include an MMRV component. So it's not just about how do we create the market opportunity, but rather that market opportunity is based on the fact that we need data, we need to be able to quantify this impact. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there, but I think the kind of exciting opportunity is at where these two pieces meet, where we're ensuring that farmers are in the driver's seat, that it works, and that we have the data. We are leaning into kind of how do we continue to do this better and be able to prove up the investments.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. That leads to like two of our next questions anyways, but Mary, I know you've been thinking about this question a lot as well, is how to get meaningful farmer adoption, and what are the avenues you think of are important beyond just the USDA incentives?
Absolutely. So I think the key thing to think about when you're working with farmers and thinking about how you can scale this is it needs to just simply make sense for them. Farmers are really looking after the economic profits of their acreage, and that's a really, really hard thing these days. Even with government subsidies, a lot of the margins for farmers in America are really razor thin, especially with rising input costs, with increasing climate changes, droughts, hailstorms, etc. We see this every single day with our farmers. About 40% of our farmers are actually harvesting really late this year because it's been a drought summer, and we're live in 10 states. So that's actually been pretty consistent across the 10 different states. So for farmers, what they're thinking about is like, how are they going to figure out whether or not this is going to be good for their land right now and also in the distant future. And they really want to make sure that you're not trying to shill something to them. You're not trying to sell snake oil, that this actually makes sense to them. So a few different things that we do. One, we are based on about a decade of academic research with Yale University and University of Illinois. We have a lot of data, publications. Farmers don't always want to read those, but a lot of data, publications, experience that actually helps bring that to the forefront and help them know we have tried this. Two, we are very lucky in that basalt is a naturally occurring nutrient-rich rock powder. It is like the bedrock of soils in Hawaii, all those lush jungles, the Amazon rainforest, that's the bedrock of the soils there. Farmers, if they Google it, they will see that sometimes basalt is actually used as a small scale, like sprinkle organic fertilizer. So it is actually safe for them. It's not going to add anything untoward into their fields. And again, farmers are thinking about, they want to give this land to their son, to their granddaughter. That is incredibly important to them. So all these co-benefits are really critical, and we try to come with the data. Finally, we really like to work with local communities, and I think that's absolutely critical. Every single farm is very, very different, and folks have to realize that the practices that will work differently on different farms are going to be different. And so we partner directly with extension agents, with NRCS folks, with local land grant universities to run specialized trials that represent the different management techniques, the different soil types, the different crop types in the state. We work with the head of corn at one of our land grant universities, the head of soybeans at the same land grant university. We do these trials so that when the farmers, they call these third parties, like they're just going to get full third party data. It's unbiased. It's not a commercial thing. And we will really want to make sure that we're tailoring our work to work for farmers in all of these different settings. And I think that's a key thing that needs to be brought to the forefront of any kind of climate smart practice that we're deploying in farms. It's going to be different on every single farm. Be upfront about that. Try to get the data as quickly as you can and as carefully as you can. And then we should all learn from there. So those are some of the key things for us.
Awesome, thanks. I'd like to also jump off of something that Alyssa just mentioned, which is talking about the importance of measuring, monitoring, and verification. So I'll come back to you, Dipti. But Jane, I know you've prepared something about this, which is, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what are some of the challenges and opportunities right now, and especially thinking about different scales when it comes to measuring and verifying soil carbon removals.
Yeah, I am a pretty consistent, we got to measure things person. So one of the things about, one of the really challenging things about measuring changes in carbon and soil is that I call soils tricksy. They're just really heterogeneous. You can walk like a few feet and be in a different soil type with fundamentally different characteristics that affect how carbon is sort of transformed and stored in that soil. So that makes it really important to measure more than people are comfortable with and willing to pay for. And that's true for any sort of soil-based system and any sort of agricultural application. So the challenges of soil MRV are heterogeneity and needing to take lots and lots of samples. And then one of the projects that we've been doing that blew up my brain a little bit is that the way that we collect soils in the field matters a whole lot. So different people sort of collect a sample in different ways. We are often asking farmers to do their own soil collections, which makes it even more challenging. If I were to go out and collect a soil, I could artificially pick a place where I know the carbon will be higher or lower, depending on what my goals are, which makes it really important that the sampling strategy is unbiased and as in whatever way that makes sense. Otherwise, you have people like me that are going to artificially inflate or reduce your numbers. And lots of people are like me and would know where to sample. Lots of people in this room probably. And then the other issue is when you bring those soils into the lab, the way the lab processes, and this is like nerdy details, literally like grinds and sieves the soil, makes a big difference for the final carbon number. And then the instrument that you run the actual soil on. So all of those things introduce additional variables and additional sources of error or variation into the final carbon number and make it really challenging to compare a soil collected at site A to a soil collected in site B. So one of the things that, and we have a paper out about this, that we're trying to sort of advocate for is some standardization around the methodologies that we use to do these things that are like really fundamental and kind of boring, but really important. And then the other side of things on MRV is that because it's so hard and expensive and it takes time, and people have to do it, people are trying to get away from having to sample at all. And there are lots of different ways that they try to get around it. One is using biogeochemical models that do a medium job representing what's actually happening in the soil. And those models can be applied in different systems, and they work pretty well in some systems and not as well in others. A model that is used at CSU a lot is called the DECENT model, and that model works pretty well for cropland systems, relatively poorly for livestock grazing systems. So like applying the right model to the right context is really important. And then folks are also trying to use remote sensing or other indirect measurement techniques. But if you talk to folks that work like at NASA or work on remote sensing and you ask them, can you measure soil carbon from space? The universal answer is no, you cannot. And if you are measuring something, you're measuring proxy variables that tell you something about what's happening in the soil, but you have to really establish those relationships and say, okay, we're measuring vegetation, cover, or greenness, and we know that that is related to soil carbon to some extent. And so we're using all these proxy allometric equations to describe what's happening in soil. But then those of us that study soil are like, well, soils are really tricksy. So remember the tricksy part, it's really difficult to estimate for the remote sensing how much carbon is in the soil. And it's certainly harder to do it at depth. So I'm continuing to sort of introduce that MRV is really hard. And so when we have all these voluntary programs that rely on some quantification scheme and MRV, we have to take that with a grain of salt, because we know when those programs are applied to, let's say, cancel out emissions that we know are very real, we need those numbers to be very real as well. And we need to have lots and lots of certainty about the carbon removal. And I'm not even talking about the durability. That's just like on an annual basis, because we know that the canceling out is of emissions that are very real. So the MRV has to be rigorous. And that's one of the biggest things we work at CSU on, and I know lots of other people work on it too, is developing MRV methods that bring up the rigor to help sort of bring up the credibility and trust in these systems.
And would you also say that kind of the scale at which we're measuring these things, like when you think about a farm scale versus a regional or national scale, that the uncertainty kind of, that calculation changes, and that maybe one is easier than the other?
Yeah, I mean, people sort of talk about, okay, you need to take a lot of samples at a farm level because farm level heterogeneity is like very real, but then your overestimates or underestimates cancel each other out when you scale regionally or at a national level. So it like comes out in the wash. And I think statistically it does. And I've seen lots of sort of curves that convince me that you could maybe take fewer samples if your area of estimate is much bigger. But I still worry about the heterogeneity at the small scale enough to want lots and lots of samples. And that's, I have a freezer full of samples in my house right now because I am paranoid. So this is a paranoia at a different level.
I just want to double down on that point for like 30 seconds here. Like, this is so, so true. We also do our MRV for enhanced rock weathering using soil samples. Our average density is every 2.5 acres, but we have certain fields where we sampled every 0.4 acres. In some cases with land-grant universities every 2 weeks, which is lots of samples. And then on our average commercial farm, we do every 6 months. And like the results have been really astounding. Like, nobody can really afford to do this every 0.4 acres. Like, that's definitely going to break all of the banks. But often we do like a pruning of this where you like randomly subsample from the samples that you've taken, and you've also grinded them up a certain time. You've subsampled from the pre-ground samples, like you do duplicates and replicates of every single step of the process, and you can really see the variability that's just introduced by how careful your lab tech was, how careful your soil sampler in the field was. We've started labeling all of our samples using the name of the soil sampler. Sometimes we fly drones and we're like, you're not sampling correctly. What are you doing? And so actually, like, this is such a good point, because the reality of farming is that it's really messy and soils are very tricksy. Like they're so different. And if you don't sample like 10 feet from where you're trying to do it, you might get results that are super wonky. And so actually I wanted to double down on that like as we think about scaling agricultural carbon removals in a high quality, rigorous, trustworthy way, a lot of attention has to be taken to the workforce that's going to do that, like the training for that, like the SOP or the standard operating procedures and the quality control there. Like it's not only the science, like that's absolutely critical, but it's actually like the implementation, because you can definitely know how the science works, but if it's not implemented correctly, you're going to have garbage in, garbage out. So that's actually a massive part. Like thinking about the landowners who are sampling for you, the vendors, the lab technicians, like that's a massive missing part of the conversation. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because we see the exact same thing and it's hard.
I'd like to bring us, we have time for maybe 2 quick questions. So we'll start with Emma.
Great. So let's start with a question from the online audience. So the USDA should have access to a lot of farm data to address data gaps, but due to privacy concerns, the data a lot of times has to be aggregated to a point where researchers maybe can't make the best use of that. So an example is cover crop incentive programs or payments might include what strategy was incentivized, but won't include geographic specificity. And so I guess how can federal agencies and researchers work more transparently together without causing concerns for farmers?
Yeah, this is such an important question, and I think has been, at the center of this conversation for a while now. I think there's been a lot of really good progress in terms of, moving away from a don't touch my data, I don't want to share anything perspective to kind of from the farmer perspective, we recognize the significant importance of this. From USDA standpoint, I think, yes, we do have, by statute, and because we do think it's important to protect farmer confidentiality, limitations in terms of what can be shared externally, publicly about farmer data. That being said, I think we have lots of ways of A, aggregating, and B, thinking through how do we ensure that these data that we have are compatible with all of the really good work that is happening, whether that is, across USDA between our implementing and our research agencies, whether it is with partners like Colorado State or others who are doing, these partnership agreements. The key component of the MMRV work that we've funded is, not just kind of go do measurements in your own world, but rather work with us so that A, we can learn from what you're doing, B, we can think through kind of how we can coordinate across systems. So I think it is not an easy solution. It is not just a kind of poof and all of the data that is being collected across the country can work together now. But from the USDA standpoint, as we're standing up various, whether it's a soil carbon monitoring network, whether it is work that our collaborators are doing, we fully, are prioritizing how do we both protect that producer confidentiality because they are coming to us as partners, but also how do we make these data real and interoperable with all of the good work that is happening across the country on this space.
Questions from the audience? If not, I have one prepared. All right.
We have the online questions
Sure.
too, if you want. Okay. So are there ways to employ AI or robotics to scale up the MRV in these projects?
Well, I was just talking to someone who has a agricultural robotics company that was initially developed to do weeding. So little robots that drive down like the crop lane and they like weed. For no-till systems, that's really important. Otherwise, you're just using a bunch of herbicide or having to till, and you kind of do away with a lot of the carbon benefits. But now they kind of like got clued into some of the USDA and ARPA-E grants and want to get these robots to also start taking soil carbon samples. So they're building a robot that can like, as they're weeding, also go and collect samples. So I think people are working on that, and that's pretty cool. And AI, gosh, that's probably more your realm.
Yeah, so I think AI has the potential to think about how we could apply to predict methane emissions. Obviously, as I said, that there are no technologies out there that we could measure methane emissions directly from individual cows or from herds. But what we are trying to develop, as everyone talked to, is that we are trying to look at some proxies. And so we do have several precision technologies that constantly measure behavior of animals, which could be tied back to the animal physiologies. And for example, we have sensors that could give so many measurements on what's happening in the rumen fermentation. And some of these are related to how rumen moves, that is, cow's gut move in a specific manner, and how that could emit certain amount of methane in a specific time. So trying to associate back physiology of the animal to some of the behavioral metrics to the precision data. This is not something that could be meant by some individual person, but we obviously need algorithms to kind of associate, because this is heavily dependent on science, but how could we integrate science to AI and identify the right algorithms and develop the right AI models to be able to bring in some of these algorithms to find the associations between the proxies and the actual measurements on the animal and how the physiologies work. I think we are able to make progress in trying to develop algorithms that could help us. Maybe these are the proxies that could allow us to predict so much of methane coming out of these animals, and by implementing different mitigation strategies. Now, can we detect the percent reduction in methane, for example, based on these proxies? So definitely this is something that's emerging. And yeah, I think interdisciplinary work is something that we would like to incorporate more of data scientists into our science world to discuss several ways by which we can develop new models and new algorithms to apply to the data sets that we derive from livestock systems.
And then a quick final comment here on the AI side. So on our team, the way that we think about AI, and I actually previously worked in software before working in the earth and planetary sciences, is that you need really good ground truth training models. We don't want to use AI on spatial imagery to do ERW, MRV. That's really not the style that we think makes sense. The complexity of the biogeochemical systems going on in the soils and these 10 feet changes are so dynamic. The way that we think about that is that AI is definitely the answer for doing this at million ton and billion ton scale, that like nobody's going to be mailing around 10 billion tons of soil samples. Like no one's going to do that. Like that's wild, right? That would not be a good use of FedEx emissions. However, in order to train these AI models, you need really strongly labeled metadata. You need really well labeled and really accurate structured data. If your data is bad, you're going to be training on things that don't make any sense, and then your model will truly not make sense and will not stand up to validation tests that are not post hoc, right? So these things are really critical. The way that we think about this is we take our soil samples every 6-ish months, every 2.5 acres. We take out the soil samples that we can tell from our QA/QC are not done properly. So that just means it takes us even more time to collect these soil samples. And I think a big thing that we all collectively should discuss is how we can aggregate our data to make more powerful data sets. The faster we get larger public data sets, the faster we will get to these AI models. If all companies just hold their data internally, we're not going to get there quite as fast, and 2030 is coming a little bit quickly. And we want those models so that we can bring the cost of carbon down to $100 or what have you as quickly as possible. So on our side, we've made a public commitment to open sourcing our data from our largest offtakes, which we think is really important. We would love to see other commercial companies follow along. We work with every single one of our farmers to get fertilization records and all this other stuff that they don't want tied to their literal address, but is okay to like county level soil samples, so that on each soil sample we take, we actually have about 35 different analyses, geochemical ones and fertilization records, et cetera, agronomic standard tests that are associated with every single one of these soil samples. And the goal there is just to grow your data set, grow all the different parameters so that you can have as many inputs as possible and have the best chance of getting a really well validated AI model as soon as possible. So long story short, companies, including Lithos, are working on this, but I think I would urge both public and private and all these sectors to think about how can we aggregate a little bit better? How can we make interoperable data sets? Because climate crisis is happening and we don't want to wait super long and all just be developing in our own little corners.
I'll take those data.
And that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, panelists.